Tonight, we are going to Rome. Not the marble Rome of the emperors, not the Rome of the Colosseum and the Forum and the triumphal arches. The other Rome, the cold Rome, the dark Rome, the Rome of January mornings when the heating failed and the water froze and the million people packed into this city had to figure out how to survive the season that nobody writes about. If you're new here, hit subscribe. This channel is built for nights exactly like this one. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. Get comfortable. Pull the covers up. The Roman winter is beginning. When you imagine ancient Rome, you imagine marble. White colonnades in bright Mediterranean sunlight. The Forum Romanum at noon, the temples gleaming, the emperors in their togas, the senators debating, the legions marching on straight stone roads through summer landscapes. This is the Rome that painting and cinema and 2,000 years of Western nostalgia have constructed, and it is not wrong exactly. Those things were real, that light was real, that marble was real, but Rome was also cold. This is the fact about ancient Rome that the standard image consistently omits, and it omits it for the same reason that any romantic vision of the past omits its inconvenient realities, because cold is not picturesque, because shivering is not heroic, because the ordinary winter suffering of a million people does not make for the kind of image that gets reproduced. Rome in winter was a city of approximately 1 million people, the largest city in the Western world for centuries, a density of human habitation that would not be matched again in Europe for over 1,000 years. And those 1 million people faced the Italian winter with the tools and technologies and strategies of the ancient world. Some of those tools were extraordinary. The hypocaust heating system was a feat of engineering that the medieval world lost and did not recover for centuries. The Roman wool industry produced some of the finest cold weather clothing in the ancient world. The wine and the food and the grain supply and the public baths. All of these were part of the Roman winter survival system. And some of those tools were simply inadequate. The apartment buildings where most Romans lived were cold in winter in a way that no engineering addressed. The poor, who could not access the better heated spaces the wealthy enjoyed, suffered from cold in winter with a directness that the historical record preserves in complaints and in death rates. Fire, the solution that every cold culture reaches for first, was a constant danger in a city of wooden apartment buildings packed together at the density of ancient Rome. You are in Rome in January, in approximately the 1st century AD. You are neither the wealthiest nor the poorest of the city's inhabitants. You are somewhere in the middle, which is where most of the city was. You have a room in an insula, one of the multi-story apartment buildings that housed the majority of Rome's population. And you have the strategies and resources that your position allows. This is the winter you are going to survive. Let us begin at the beginning. Let us begin with the cold. Rome is not cold the way Britain is cold, or Norway, or the Rhine frontier where the Roman legions wintered in conditions that were genuinely life-threatening without proper preparation. But Rome is colder than the popular imagination allows. The city sits at approximately 42 degrees north latitude, the same latitude as Chicago, as northern Spain, as the coast of Croatia. The Italian peninsula has a Mediterranean climate, which means mild, wet winters, rather than the bitter, dry cold of continental Europe. But mild is a relative term. In January, Rome's average temperature is around 7 degrees Celsius during the day and drops to approximately 3 at night. Rain is frequent. Wind is present. The combination of moderate cold, high humidity, and persistent rain produces a cold that penetrates clothing and buildings with a thoroughness that dry cold of the same temperature does not. And the Roman building stock was not designed to resist this. The marble and stone that dominate the imagination of ancient Rome are excellent building materials for hot climates. They absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night, producing a natural cooling effect that made Roman buildings comfortable in summer. In winter, this same property worked against the inhabitants. Stone absorbs cold the way it absorbs heat, thoroughly, patiently, with the large thermal mass of a material that changes temperature slowly. A stone building that has been cold for weeks radiates that cold back into the space it encloses. Glass windows, which would have addressed this significantly, were known in the Roman world, but rare in ordinary housing. Most windows were closed with wooden shutters, which blocked wind and rain but not cold. The shuttered Roman apartment in January was dark as well as cold. The shutters that kept the weather out also kept the light out, and the oil lamps that substituted for natural light produced heat as a byproduct, but not nearly enough to warm a room. You wake in your room in the insula on a January morning, and your breath makes a cloud in the air. This is how Roman January begins. Your home is a room in an insula, and you should understand what that means before we go further. The insula, literally island, was the multi-story apartment building that housed the majority of Rome's urban population. They rose to 5, 6, 7 stories in the densest parts of the city, built of concrete and brick over a timber frame, packed together along narrow streets with a density that no modern city planning authority would approve. They were the housing solution of a city that needed to accommodate 1 million people in a limited urban footprint, and they accomplished this with the efficiency that all such solutions employ, which is to provide the minimum adequate space at the maximum possible occupancy. Your room is on the 3rd floor. This matters for several reasons. The ground floor of an insula was typically occupied by shops, the tabernae that lined the Roman street, opening directly onto the pavement, their stone counters worn smooth by generations of commerce. These ground floor spaces were warmer than the upper floors for structural reasons. The thermal mass of the ground itself contributed some heat, and the commercial activity generated warmth. They were also more expensive. The upper floors were cheaper and colder. The higher you went, the further from any source of residual warmth from below, the more exposed to the wind through whatever gaps existed in the construction, the more precarious. The upper stories of insulae were the ones most likely to collapse, a fact the Roman world acknowledged with the casualness of people who have no alternative. The 3rd floor is a compromise, high enough to be affordable on your income, low enough that the collapse risk is somewhat lower than the upper stories. Cold in January, but not as cold as the 7th floor. Your room is perhaps 12 square meters. It contains a bed, a wooden frame with a rope base and a wool mattress, a small table, a lampstand, and the personal items that constitute your portable world. There is no kitchen. Cooking in the insulae was officially discouraged and frequently banned because of the fire risk, which means you eat out or you eat food that requires no cooking, or you cook over a small brazier and hope the building inspector does not notice. The walls are stone and plaster. The plaster is cold. You are dressed. Let us find warmth. The primary heating technology of the ordinary Roman was the brazier, a metal basin, iron, bronze, occasionally terracotta for the cheaper versions, mounted on legs, filled with charcoal, lit and placed in the room to provide radiant heat. It was simple, it was portable, it was effective within a limited radius, and it was dangerous. The Roman brazier heated a circle of air around it, perhaps 2 or 3 meters in diameter. Within that circle, the warmth was real and appreciable. Beyond it, the room temperature was essentially unchanged, the stone walls and the cold air conducting away whatever heat the brazier produced before it could warm the space as a whole. The Romans understood this and arranged themselves accordingly. You sat near the brazier, worked near the brazier, placed your bed near the brazier in winter, and accepted that the far corners of your room were going to be cold regardless. The charcoal that fueled the brazier was a constant expense. Wood and charcoal were sold in Rome by the basket and the bundle, and the price fluctuated with the season in the way that all heating fuel prices fluctuate, highest in winter when demand was greatest, falling in spring when the need diminished. The poor managed this by buying small quantities frequently, which was less efficient and more expensive per unit than buying in bulk, and by using the cheapest available fuel, which burned less cleanly and produced more smoke. The smoke was a significant problem. Brazier heating in an enclosed room produced carbon monoxide as a byproduct of the charcoal combustion, and carbon monoxide in an enclosed space is deadly at sufficient concentration. The Romans knew this. The writers who mention the brazier also mention the need to ventilate the room, to leave the shutter slightly open, to be attentive to the air quality. But the cold that the open shutter admitted was exactly what the brazier was trying to counteract, and the balance between adequate ventilation and adequate warmth was not always correctly struck. The historical record includes cases of deaths attributed to brazier fumes in enclosed winter rooms. You leave your shutter cracked. The cold comes in. The brazier does its work. Your toga is not going to help you today. The toga, the garment that is the visual signature of Roman identity in the popular imagination, was a ceremonial garment worn for formal occasions, not for keeping warm on a January morning. It was a large semicircle of wool, draped in a specific and elaborate way around the body, and it was indeed wool, and it was indeed warm in the passive sense that wool is warm. But it required two hands to keep it arranged correctly. It impeded practical movement, and it was not the garment that Romans actually wore for warmth and daily function. For warmth, Romans layered. The tunica was the foundation, a simple wool garment pulled over the head, belted at the waist, reaching to approximately the knee. In winter, you wore multiple tunicae, 2, 3, sometimes 4, for those who felt the cold keenly. The Emperor Augustus, whose surviving correspondence includes specific mentions of his cold sensitivity, was known to wear 4 tunicas in winter, along with an undershirt, a chest wrap, and thigh protectors under his outer garments. Whether this was typical or exceptional is debated, but the principle of layering was not unusual. Over the tunicae, the lacerna, a rectangular woolen cloak fastened at the right shoulder with a fibula, which could be worn by anyone regardless of social status, and was the practical winter garment of Roman daily life. The lacerna came in different qualities and weights: fine wool for the wealthy, coarser wool for everyone else. But the basic function was the same: a layer of wool over the body that trapped warmth and shed rain. For the feet, calci, leather shoes with thick soles, laced up the front. Wool socks, called udones, were worn inside them. Roman literary sources mention udones frequently enough that socks were clearly standard winter wear, not unusual or exotic. And for the head, a hood for those who had one, or the lacerna pulled up over the head in the way that all hooded garments have been used in cold weather in all periods of history. You are layered. You are as warm as wool and leather allow. You go out. The street hits you immediately. Not with cold alone, with noise, with smell, with the specific sensory overload of a Roman street in the morning that is not diminished by winter. Rome did not quiet down in January. A city of 1 million people does not quiet down in any season because the daily requirements of 1 million people, food, water, commerce, movement, do not take a seasonal break. The street is wet. The rain that fell last night has turned the narrow, stone-paved lanes between the insulae into channels of grey water, the street drainage doing what it does, which is to move the water toward the drains, but not immediately. Your shoes, which are leather and not waterproof in any reliable sense, are going to be wet before you have gone a block. The smell of the Roman street in winter is different from the summer smell. The summer smell is famous and not pleasant. The warm city, the waste, the press of bodies in the heat. The winter smell is the summer smell at lower temperature, which reduces but does not eliminate it, layered with the specific cold smell of wet stone and the wood smoke and charcoal smoke from thousands of braziers and cooking fires that now constitutes Rome's winter air quality. The air quality in ancient Rome, particularly in winter when every household was burning something for heat, was poor by any standard. The particulate matter from charcoal braziers and wood fires and the oil lamps that lit the interior spaces combined with the natural valley fog that the Tiber produced and the humidity of the Italian winter to create a low-lying smog that contemporaries noticed and complained about. Horace described leaving Rome for the countryside as relief from the city's smoke. Seneca described the particular quality of the city's winter air with the precision of someone who had noticed its effect on his lungs. You breathe it in. This is Roman winter air. You are going to the baths. The thermae are the most important fact about surviving winter in Rome. Not the brazier, not the clothing, not the wine. The public baths, available to essentially every person in the city, regardless of economic status, providing hot water and heated rooms as a matter of public infrastructure in a city that understood the connection between public health, social cohesion, and the management of 1 million people living in close proximity. The great thermae of imperial Rome, the baths of Caracalla, the baths of Diocletian, the baths of Agrippa, were not simply bathing facilities in the modern sense. They were community centers of extraordinary sophistication, libraries, gymnasiums, gardens, lecture halls, shops, colonnaded walkways, and at their core, the bathing sequence itself. The apoditerium where you changed, the frigidarium with its cold pool, the tepidarium with its warm air, and the caldarium, the hot room, where the heat was most intense. The heating system that produced this heat was the hypocaust. The hypocaust, literally fire beneath, was a Roman engineering achievement that deserves the wonder it receives. The floor of the heated rooms was raised on columns of terracotta tile, the suspensori, creating a space beneath through which hot air from a furnace circulated. The hot air rose through hollow tiles in the walls, heating the room from floor and sides simultaneously. The result was radiant heat from below and above, the most efficient form of heating available before modern technology. You enter the caldarium now. The heat is immediate and total. After the cold of the street, after the damp and the wind and the wet shoes, the heat of the caldarium is not comfortable. It is overwhelming, almost shocking. The body's thermoreceptors going from one extreme to the other without transition. You stand in it for a moment and feel the cold leaving your muscles and your joints with the specificity of a sensation that has been present for so long you had stopped noticing it. The water in the pools steams. Other Romans are here, as they are always here in winter. The baths were most crowded in the coldest months because the logic of the baths as a source of warmth was clearest when the alternative was a cold room and an inadequate brazier. You lower yourself into the water. The warmth is extraordinary. The bath is not a private act in Rome. This is the first and most fundamental adjustment the modern imagination must make when it considers the Roman baths. You are not in a bathroom. You are in a social space, one of the most important social spaces in Roman daily life, and the bathing is almost incidental to the range of other activities that the thermae accommodated and that Romans conducted there. Around you in the caldarium are perhaps 100 people. They represent the full social range of Rome's urban population, somewhat flattened by the specific leveling effect of being unclothed in a shared space. The senator and the freedman and the craftsman are all equally naked in the pool, and while social distinctions did not disappear in the baths, the wealthy had attendants. The best positions in the room were occupied by the most socially powerful. The bathing sequence varied by class in its details. The baths were more genuinely egalitarian than almost any other space in Roman life. The conversations here are real and varied. Business is conducted in the baths, deals made, contracts discussed. The social networking that was essential to advancement in Roman society conducted in the specific intimacy that shared nudity produced. The baths were where you caught up on the news. The Roman equivalent of the newspaper was oral, circulated through networks of conversation, and the baths were one of the primary nodes in that network. Legal business, political gossip, the latest event in the imperial court as it had filtered down through the city's information channels. All of this moved through the baths. Philosophers lectured in the colonnades. Poets recited. Mathematicians taught. The great thermae maintained libraries in their buildings because reading was considered an appropriate activity in the post-bath relaxation period. You are also simply warm. This is perhaps the most important thing the baths provide in January, a place where you are genuinely, totally warm, for as long as you are willing to stay, at a price that is either free or nominal, depending on the period and the patron. You stay for several hours. When you finally leave, the street cold hits you again. But you have been warm. You carry that warmth with you into the afternoon. The Roman understanding of food and heat was partly correct and partly not, but it was systematic, and it shaped the winter diet in specific ways. Roman medical theory, inherited from the Greeks and elaborated extensively by Roman physicians, most importantly Galen, held that food had thermal properties beyond their caloric content. Foods were classified as hot, cold, moist, or dry in combination. And the correct diet in cold weather emphasized hot and dry foods that would counteract the cold's tendency to make the body cold and damp. Wine was hot and dry, which made it medically appropriate for winter consumption at quantities that would not be medically recommended in summer. Spices, pepper, ginger, cinnamon, all imported from the East at significant expense, were hot and therefore warming. Legumes were warming. Root vegetables were generally warming. The Roman winter diet was built around what was available, which in January meant what had been preserved from the autumn harvest, what the winter growing season of the Mediterranean climate provided, and what could be imported from the provinces. Wheat was the foundation, as it always was. Bread, the staple of the Roman diet in all seasons. In winter, the bread was supplemented with the preserved foods of the autumn: dried figs, olives pickled in brine, dried beans, lentils, garum, the fermented fish sauce that was the universal condiment of the Roman world, the ketchup and soy sauce and Worcestershire sauce of its time, kept indefinitely and flavored everything. Fresh vegetables were more limited in January than in the other seasons, but not absent. The Italian winter climate was mild enough that certain crops, brassicas, leeks, turnips, continued to grow, and the Roman market system was efficient enough that what was growing in the warmer parts of the peninsula reached the city regularly. You eat at a thermopolium, the Roman equivalent of a fast food counter, a stone counter with ceramic pots sunk into it containing various hot prepared foods. The pots are kept warm by the charcoal in the counter below. You eat a bowl of thick lentil soup with a piece of bread and a small cup of spiced wine, standing at the counter because there are no seats and it is cold, and the warm bowl in your hands is its own kind of heating. The lentils are hot and substantial. The wine is warm. For a few minutes, you are content. Wine deserves its own chapter. Wine in ancient Rome was not a luxury. It was a dietary staple, consumed by virtually every member of the population regardless of social class, in quantities that would be considered remarkable by modern standards. The Roman daily ration of wine, when it was issued to soldiers, to slaves, to workers on public projects, was approximately a litre per person per day. Civilian consumption was comparable. This was not wine as we know it. Roman wine was typically much stronger than modern wine, The fermentation processes of the ancient world produced wines with higher alcohol content, and it was almost always diluted with water before drinking. The ratio of water to wine varied by social occasion and personal taste, but drinking wine neat was considered barbarian, literally. The Greeks and Romans both associated the consumption of undiluted wine with the uncivilized peoples beyond their cultural borders. In winter, the wine was heated. Hot wine, mulsum when sweetened with honey, calda when simply warmed with water and spices, was the Roman hot drink, consumed at the thermopolium, at home, at dinner parties, and in the taverns that lined the Roman streets. The warming effect was both physical, hot liquid raising the body's temperature briefly, and the vasodilatory effect of the alcohol, which produced the sensation of warmth as blood moved toward the skin's surface. This sensation of warmth was real and also, in the medical understanding of the time, genuinely beneficial. The physicians who recommended hot wine in winter were not wrong about the subjective experience, even if the mechanism they ascribed to it, the wine's hot and dry qualities counteracting winter's cold and damp, was not quite accurate. Caupona and Thermopolia, the wine shops and cooked food counters that lined Roman streets, were doing exceptional business in January. They were the warm spaces of the ordinary Roman's day, the places where you stood or sat close to someone else, where the cooking fire and the bodies generated a pocket of warmth above the ambient temperature, where the hot wine did what hot wine has always done for cold people, which is to make things briefly and reliably better. You hold your cup. The wine steams. The cold outside the doorway is still there. For now, the wine is enough. Not everyone in Rome was cold. This is the important qualification to the picture of universal winter suffering. And it is important because it illustrates the extraordinary range of winter experience within the same city, the same century, sometimes the same street. The wealthy Roman, living in a domus, a private house built around an atrium and garden with a hypocaust heating system, experienced winter in Rome in a way that was not merely different in degree from the experience of the insular tenant, but different in kind. The hypocaust we briefly encountered in the baths was also installed in the private homes of the wealthy. The floor raised on terracotta pilae, the hot air circulating beneath, the walls hollow for the rising heat. This system produced a room temperature that could be maintained at comfortable levels regardless of the outside weather, as long as the furnace beneath was tended. The furnace required a slave specifically assigned to it during the heating season. This was not a coincidence. The hypocaust was not only a technological luxury, but a labor luxury, requiring someone to manage the fuel and the fire and the temperature continuously. The connection between warmth in winter and the ownership of enslaved people who maintained that warmth was direct and explicit in the Roman world, though it was not remarked upon as notable in the sources, which tells you something about the perspective of the people writing the sources. The rooms heated by the hypocaust were different spaces from the brazier-warmed rooms of the insula. The heat was radiant, even, everywhere in the room, not concentrated in a small circle around a central source, but present at floor level and wall level and ceiling level simultaneously. The room was warm to walk across barefoot, which Romans in heated rooms often did. The cold did not accumulate in corners. You know this space exists because you have been in such a room once, at a dinner given by someone considerably more prosperous than yourself. The memory of that floor warmth, walking across it on a January evening, is one of the specific memories that January mornings in your insular room conjure. The floor of your room is not warm. It is stone. You put on your shoes. The warmth you are pursuing all winter is also the thing that could kill you most suddenly. Fire was the chronic, pervasive, existential threat of the Roman city, and it was most acute in winter, when every household was heating with open flame, and the building stock that surrounded those flames was built of the materials that burn best. The Roman insula was typically constructed with a concrete and brick lower structure, which resisted fire reasonably well, and a timber-framed upper structure, which did not resist fire at all. The walls between apartments were not fire barriers in any modern sense. The density of the insulae, the streets between them narrow enough that sparks could jump from one building to the next, meant that a fire beginning in one building could spread before any intervention was possible. Rome burned, repeatedly, famously. The Great Fire of 64 AD, the fire associated with Nero, the fire that burned for 6 days and destroyed approximately 2/3 of the city, was not an anomaly. It was the largest expression of a risk that was chronic and well understood. Rome had vigiles, a fire brigade, one of the first organized municipal firefighting forces in history, precisely because fire was a constant threat that required constant management. The vigiles patrolled the city at night, watching for fire. They carried firefighting equipment, buckets, pumps, hooks for pulling down burning structures to create fire breaks. They were also a police force because the night streets of Rome were not entirely safe, but their primary function was fire detection and suppression. In your insula, in January, you are managing fire from your brazier with the specific attention that living above 5 stories of other people's braziers requires. You ventilate. You keep the brazier away from anything flammable. You do not leave it unattended. You note where the nearest water supply is, the fountain in the street below, always running from the aqueduct in the way that people who are aware of a specific danger note the relevant precautions. The vigiles pass in the street below. Their lanterns cast moving shadows on the wall of the building opposite. The brazier glows. You watch it. One of the things that made Rome extraordinary in winter, extraordinary by ancient standards, but also remarkable by the standards of any pre-modern city, was the water. The Roman aqueduct system delivered approximately 1 million cubic meters of water to the city every day. 11 major aqueducts by the height of the empire, drawing water from springs and rivers in the Apennine Hills and the Alban Hills, carrying it across the landscape on stone channels, supported by the iconic aqueduct arches, delivering it to the fountains and baths and the private connections of the wealthy that were distributed across the city. This water ran continuously, not intermittently, not only when a pump was working or a reservoir was being filled, continuously, by gravity, the constant flow of the channels maintaining the pressure that kept the fountains running and the baths supplied. In winter, this continuity was the difference between water available and water unavailable, because the fountains of Rome, fed by the constant flow of the aqueducts, did not freeze. The fountains, the lacus, the public water points distributed through the city at approximately every 100 meters in the densely populated areas, provided the ordinary Roman's primary water supply. You went to the fountain with your amphora, filled it, carried it home, several times a day if necessary. The water was clean by ancient world standards. The spring sources were carefully managed, the channels periodically inspected and cleaned. The contamination that killed people in cities dependent on surface water or shallow wells largely absent from Rome's aqueduct supply. In January, the fountain was also a social gathering point with the particular character of winter social gathering. People standing at the water with their vessels, exchanging information and conversation in the way that shared physical proximity always produces conversation, and doing so in the cold air with the speed and directness of people who would rather be warm. The water from the fountain was cold. Cold water in January carried in a terracotta amphora through cold streets to a cold room, arriving cold. This was the water you had. It was clean. It was available. In a world where water was often neither of those things, this was not nothing. The Roman winter was not unstructured. The calendar, the Roman calendar, which was the official organizing framework of the year as managed by the state, the priests, and eventually Julius Caesar's Reformation, was full in every season. But the winter months had their own specific character, shaped by the festivals and obligations that fell in them. December brought the Saturnalia, the most important popular festival of the Roman year. 7 days, later extended to 7 from the original 3, of deliberate social inversion and communal celebration. Slaves were served by their masters. Schools closed. The courts closed. The military campaign season was over, and the legions were in winter quarters. The exchange of gifts, Saturnalia gifts, were small wax figurines and earthenware dolls, plus the practical gifts of candles and writing tablets, was universal. The feasting was real. The temporary dissolution of ordinary social hierarchy was real enough that the sources comment on it in ways that suggest it was genuinely experienced as unusual. The Saturnalia gave the Roman winter its most vivid cultural expression and its influence on the subsequent Christian celebration of Christmas, which absorbed its timing, its gift-giving, its candles, its emphasis on communal warmth and shared celebration, is one of the most thoroughly documented examples of cultural continuity across religious change. After Saturnalia came the deepest months. January and February, the old Roman year's beginning and continuation, named for Janus, the two-faced god of transitions, and for Februar, the purification rites that prepared the community for the New Year's agricultural season. The winter months had their festivals, their obligations, their specific rhythm. The Roman did not experience winter simply as a gap between warmer times, but as a season with its own character, its own requirements, its own pleasures in the Saturnalia, and its own hardships in the cold dark of February. You lived by this calendar. The next festival was a specific number of days away. The warmth of the community gathering it promised was a concrete and anticipated thing. The night falls early in January Rome. Sunset at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, followed by the long Roman night during which the streets were theoretically off-limits to wheeled vehicles. The delivery wagons that were banned from the city centre during daylight hours were allowed in after dark, producing the continuous noise of wheels on stone and the shouting of drivers and the braying of animals that Juvenal famously described as making sleep impossible in Rome. The Roman night was not quiet. Martial described his insular neighbours, the schoolteacher beginning his lessons before dawn, the baker active through the night, the coppersmiths, the money changers counting coin, the various tradespeople whose work happened in the hours of darkness because they could not do it during the crowded day, with the exasperated vividness of someone writing from direct experience. Rome was noisy at night in a way that no amount of wanting to sleep fully overrode. Your bed was what you had in your room: the wooden frame, the rope supports, the wool mattress. Mattresses in the Roman world ranged from stuffed wool to stuffed straw to, for the wealthy, stuffed feathers. The same range you encountered in the medieval world. The same hierarchy of softness corresponding to the hierarchy of resources. Your mattress is wool-stuffed and adequate. The blankets were wool. Multiple in winter, layered, as everything was layered in the Roman winter response to cold. The heaviest blanket was the one on top, which in extreme cold was augmented with a cloak or a spare tunic or anything else available that would keep the cold out. The Romans slept in 2 phases, as medieval people did. The first sleep, followed by a period of wakefulness, then the second sleep. This was not insomnia. It was the natural human sleep pattern in conditions of genuine darkness, before artificial lighting extended the evening and compressed the sleep into a single consolidated block. In the between-sleep hour, in January, Romans used the time for prayer, for writing if they were literate, for conversation with whoever was nearby. Pliny the Elder, whose prodigious literary output was produced in these nocturnal hours by lamplight while his household slept, was an extreme example of a practice that was normal. You lie in the dark of your room. The delivery wagons rumble in the street below. The brazier is banked, still warm, not bright. The first sleep has you. We need to stop here and be honest about something the sources are inconsistent in acknowledging. The winter experience we have been describing, the baths, the wine, the brazier, the wool clothing, the thermopolium, the Saturnalia, was the winter experience of the Roman who had resources to apply to the problem. Not the wealthy Roman whose hypocaust heated domus made the whole question theoretical, but the middling Roman, the craftsman, the freedman, the small trader, the soldier on leave. The very poor of Rome experienced winter differently. The very poor of Rome did not have a brazier, or had one they could not afford to fuel consistently. They did not have adequate wool clothing. The layering system required multiple garments, and multiple garments of reasonable quality cost money. They could not spend the day in the thermae, which were cheap but not free in all periods, and which required the leisure time that a day laborer working from dawn to dusk did not have. They ate at the thermopolium when they could afford it, and ate cold when they could not. The Roman city had a grain dole, the annona, a distribution of free or subsidized grain to the registered poor of Rome that was one of the oldest and most consistent features of the republican and imperial government. This provided calories. It did not provide warmth. The grain dole kept people alive in winter, in the literal sense of preventing starvation. It did not address the cold, the fire risk, the inadequate housing, the specific vulnerability of the very young and the very old to winter conditions. The mortality statistics of ancient Rome, to the extent that they can be reconstructed, show the seasonal pattern that all pre-modern mortality statistics show. Elevated death rates in winter and spring, driven by respiratory disease, by the complications of cold exposure, by the exacerbation of chronic conditions that inadequate nutrition and inadequate warmth produced. The old died in Rome in January. The infants died in Rome in January. The poor died in Rome in January. And the city continued, because cities always continue, because the million people in Rome did not collectively experience the winter deaths of their most vulnerable as a disruption to the city's function, but as the season's ordinary cost. This is the part of Roman winter that the marble does not show. It was real. You have a cough, not a serious cough, the kind of cough that January in Rome produces in many of its inhabitants. The upper respiratory inflammation that the cold air and the smoky streets and the damp buildings encourage. It has been present for 3 days. It is not getting worse. It is also not getting better. The Roman medical system was, for the ancient world, sophisticated. Galen, whose work synthesized Greek medical theory with a lifetime of clinical observation, and who was the most influential physician in the Western world for over 1,000 years after his death, was working in Rome in the 2nd century AD. His theories of humoral medicine, inherited from Hippocrates and elaborated extensively, provided the framework within which Roman physicians understood and treated disease. The humoral framework was not entirely wrong. The observation that cold and damp conditions were associated with respiratory disease was accurate, even if the mechanism, cold and damp humors, disturbing the body's balance rather than viruses and bacteria, was not. The recommendation of warmth, rest, and nourishing food for respiratory illness was sound. The use of specific herbs, honey for soothing the throat, which has genuine antimicrobial properties, thyme, which has demonstrated efficacy against respiratory pathogens, steam inhalation for congested airways, was grounded in observations that modern pharmacognosy has partly validated. The Roman physician you consult charges you a fee for the consultation. He examines your throat. He notes the quality of your cough, productive or dry, frequency, whether it is worse at night or in the morning. He asks about your diet and your sleeping arrangements and the quality of the air in your room. He prescribes honey and hot wine with specific herbs. He recommends you avoid cold air as much as possible and stay near a heat source. This is not bad advice. You follow it. The cough improves over the following week. Rome in January was full of coughs. Most of them resolved. Some of them did not. One of the ways Romans survived winter had nothing to do with fire or clothing or architecture. It had to do with who you knew. The Roman social system of patronage and clientage, the web of mutual obligation that ran through Roman society from the emperor at the top to the freed slave at the bottom, was partly a survival mechanism in all seasons. But in winter, its practical importance was most immediate. The client, the person of lower status who attached themselves to a patron of higher status, was expected to appear at the patron's house every morning for the salutatio, the morning greeting. In January, this required getting up in the cold dark of the insula room, dressing, walking through cold streets to a neighborhood where the houses were larger and the streets somewhat cleaner, and waiting in the patron's atrium, which was at least under a roof, though the traditional Roman atrium with its open impluvium was not sealed against the weather until the patron emerged to acknowledge your presence. This was the cost. The benefit was real. The client received from the patron, in the best cases, regular meals. The sportula, originally a basket of food, later a cash equivalent, referrals, legal assistance, employment, housing, and the general protection that a powerful person could provide in a society where informal power networks were as important as formal legal structures. In winter specifically, the client who had a good relationship with a wealthy patron might be invited to the patron's dinner, a warm house, a heated room, a substantial meal, the warmth of company in the specific way that a patron's well-staffed winter dining room provided. This was not charity in the modern sense. It was an exchange, and both parties understood it as such. But the exchange, in January, had a thermal dimension alongside its social and economic dimensions. The warmth of the patron's house was real. You went to the salutatio. You waited in the atrium. The patron acknowledged you. You received the sportula. You were slightly warmer on the way home than you were on the way there, because the patron's atrium was sheltered from the wind, and the sportula was enough for a hot meal. The system worked. Beyond Rome, across the vast territory of the empire, the Roman army was wintering. The campaign season ended in late autumn, not by universal rule, but by the practical reality that armies in the ancient world did not campaign effectively in winter. The supply lines that sustained a moving army became unreliable in winter weather. The ground conditions that cavalry and heavy infantry required became problematic. The daylight hours required to march and to fight were insufficient. So the legions went into winter quarters. In the provinces, Britain, Germany, the Danube frontier, Syria, the winter quarters were permanent fortresses built specifically for this purpose. The castra hiberna that became in many cases the nuclei of the permanent civilian settlements that grew up around them. The legionary fortress in winter was a self-contained community, heated, provisioned, structured. The hypocaust appeared in the barracks of legionary fortresses as a standard feature in many periods. The army understood that cold soldiers were less effective soldiers and applied the same thermal engineering to military installations that wealthy Romans applied to their private houses. The soldiers in winter quarters were not idle. Training continued. It was easier to maintain physical condition with structured activity than to rebuild it from scratch in spring. Construction continued. The constant building program that Roman military occupation produced continued through winter on the projects that weather allowed. Administrative work, weapon maintenance, equipment repair, the various duties of a military installation that did not require fair weather. The soldier who had served on the northern frontier and the civilian in Rome shared the experience of January cold. The soldier had better infrastructure for managing it. The legionary fortress was a more efficient thermal environment than the insula, but shared the universal ancient world experience of winter as a season to be endured rather than ignored. Both of them were waiting for spring. Spring meant the campaign season. Spring meant the fields. Spring meant warmth. The city was full of animals in winter, as in every season. Not the farm animals of the countryside. Rome was a city, and the production of food happened outside its walls and was brought in daily through the roads. But the animals of urban life, the oxen and donkeys and mules that moved goods through the streets at night, the horses of the cavalry and the wealthy, the dogs that were everywhere in the Roman city and that served as watchdogs and companions, and in some cases as workers, the cats that were appreciated in kitchens and grain stores for the same reason the medieval world kept them. And in winter, the animals clustered toward warmth in the same way people did. The dog that had spent spring and summer sleeping in the street found ways to be inside in January. The workshop animals, the donkeys that turned the mills, the oxen that pulled carts, were housed rather than left outside when the temperature dropped. The practical Roman understanding of animals as economic assets meant that protecting them from cold was not sentimental but rational. A dead ox was an economic loss. The insulae typically had ground floor spaces that housed animals, along with their keepers and sometimes their commercial operations. The warmth that large animals produced, the same physics that made the Viking longhouse warmer with cattle in it, was part of the thermal economy of the building, barely acknowledged but real. The pigeons and sparrows that populated Roman public spaces in their thousands moved closer to the warmer, more sheltered areas of the city in winter. The fish in the garden pools of the wealthy froze sometimes, and the wealthy worried about them, because ornamental fish were investments as well as decorations. You pass a dog in the street, pressed against the wall where some residual warmth from the hypocaust heated room beyond the stone is slightly detectable. He is not yours. He is no one's specifically. He belongs to the street in the way that many Roman animals belong to the street, fed by whoever fed him, attached to whatever warmth he could find. You understand him exactly. You are doing the same thing. The Saturnalia is coming, and the city knows it. In the week before the festival, which ran from the 17th of December for between 3 and 7 days, depending on the period, Rome had the specific quality of a city preparing for something, not the solemn preparation of a religious observance in the formal sense, though the Saturnalia had its formal religious elements. The sacrifice at the temple of Saturn in the Forum, the public feast that followed. But the popular preparation, the markets full of gifts, the increased traffic of people visiting their social networks with small presents, the conversations in the street and the baths that had a lighter quality than January's conversations. The Saturnalia was the Roman world's great democratic festival, the one moment in the formal calendar when the social inversion that ordinary Roman life kept strictly managed was not only permitted but required. Slaves ate at their masters' tables. Masters served their slaves, not permanently, not as an abolition of the institution, but as an annual ritual acknowledgement of the artificial nature of the social hierarchy that the rest of the year maintained as absolute. The gifts were small, but the giving was universal. The cere, wax candles, were given because the Saturnalia coincided with the solstice period, and candles in the dark of December were both practical and symbolic. The sigillaria, small earthenware figurines, the specific Saturnalia gift, were sold at stalls that appeared specifically for the festival period. The writing tablets and the styluses that were among the conventional gifts had a specific resonance in a society that valued literacy as a path to advancement. The feasting was real. Whatever the ordinary Roman was eating in January, the Saturnalia feast was better. The patron who invited clients to dinner in the Saturnalia provided a meal appropriate to the festival's significance. The communal feast in neighborhood associations, the collegia that organized the social and religious life of Rome's various communities, served food appropriate to celebration. The wine was not diluted to the normal ratio. The fires were built higher. The city was briefly, genuinely warm, not only thermally, but in the way that communal celebration produces warmth, the specific human warmth of people who are, for a few days, permitted to acknowledge that they are all in the same cold city together. You are part of this. You exchange your small gift. You accept the one given to you. The candle you receive burns in your room tonight. The room is, for once, bright. We need to stop here, as we have stopped at similar points in previous videos, and look honestly at who was keeping all of this warm. The hypocaust that heated the wealthy Roman's house required a slave at the furnace. The dinner that the patron provided at the Saturnalia required slaves to prepare it. The water that was carried from the fountain to the insula in January was carried by whoever carried it, which in a wealthy household was a slave. The brazier that burned in your room was purchased with money that came from whatever labor you performed. But in wealthy households, the labor that produced the wealth was slave labor, and the warmth that wealth purchased was, in the final analysis, produced by people who did not share in it. Rome at the height of the empire had perhaps 2 to 3 million enslaved people in Italy alone, and perhaps 15% of the total imperial population, tens of millions of people, in a condition of legal enslavement. They came from every corner of the empire and beyond, from the wars and raids that Roman expansion produced, from the children of enslaved parents, from the debt bondage that Roman law permitted in various forms. The enslaved person in a Roman household experienced winter as a function of their role and their owner's practices. The house slave who slept in the kitchen or in a heated room close to the family's living space had a warmer winter than the agricultural slave who worked the fields in the Italian countryside. The slave who had developed a skill, the secretary, the physician, the skilled craftsman, the educated tutor, might be housed in conditions that approximated free life. The slave who was worked in the mines or on the large estates experienced winter in conditions that the sources describe only obliquely because the sources were written by people who were not there. The Saturnalia acknowledged this, which is perhaps why it was so important. The annual ritual acknowledgement that the hierarchy was contingent rather than natural, expressed through the inversion of serving and being served, it was the society's way of knowing, formally and officially, and then setting aside, the truth about its own foundations. The candle from the Saturnalia burns in your room. Somewhere in this city, someone else stoked the furnace that kept someone else warm. The winter is survived collectively, not equally. January is behind you. This is not a small thing. January is the month that kills more people in the ancient world. Not dramatically, not in single large events, but in the accumulated mortality of old age and infancy, and chronic illness and poverty that winter concentrates into its coldest and longest stretch. Having made it through January is a genuine statistical achievement, and the Romans knew this. February arrives with the quality that late winter always has. Not spring, not yet, but the first hints that the worst has passed. The days are perceptibly longer. The Tiber is still cold and the mornings are still cold, and February can produce some of the worst weather of the Italian winter. The Mediterranean climate's tendency to deposit its rainfall in late winter means that February rain can be heavy and persistent in ways that December and January are not. But the quality of the cold has changed. Not its temperature, necessarily. February can be as cold as January in Rome, but the feel of it is different because it is cold with an end in sight. The equinox is a month away. The agricultural calendar is beginning to stir. The earliest spring planting in the Campanian fields to Rome's south was already underway, and the produce markets would begin to reflect this within weeks. The Lupercalia fell in February. On the 15th, the ancient festival of purification and fertility that was one of the oldest in the Roman calendar, older than the Republic, a survival of something pre-Roman that Roman religion had absorbed and continued without fully understanding. Half-naked young men ran through the streets, striking people with strips of goatskin, and the people they struck, particularly women, were believed to receive fertility and easy childbirth as a result. The Lupercalia was spring trying to happen in February. The culture's insistence that the cold and dark were ending before the calendar fully confirmed it. You watched the runners go past. You are still in your wool layers, but you watched. The wealthy Roman had a study. The very wealthy Roman had a library. In the great thermae, there were libraries, rooms adjacent to the bathing complex where books, scrolls, the Roman form of the book could be consulted, where readers could sit in the warm interior of the bathing complex and read in the specific leisure that the baths accommodated. This was not a peripheral feature. The libraries of the great thermae were real institutions, stocked with real books, used by real readers. Rome had public libraries. The Bibliotheca Ulpia, founded by Trajan in the forum that bore his name, was one of the largest in the ancient world. The great private libraries of wealthy Romans contained thousands of scrolls. The commercial book trade, the scriptoria, where slaves copied texts for sale, was active and producing a range of material that included everything from legal texts and philosophical treatises to the popular fiction and light verse that were consumed by a literate public larger than any subsequent European society would have for over 1,000 years. Reading in ancient Rome was an oral activity as much as a silent one. To read was typically to read aloud, the standard practice of the ancient world, which experienced written text as the representation of spoken language rather than as a visual medium with its own protocols. A Roman reading alone in a library was typically reading quietly aloud, their lips moving and their voice at the level of a murmur. A Roman reading to an audience was performing. In winter, the spaces where reading happened were warm spaces. The private study heated by the hypocaust, the library in the thermae, where the residual warmth of the bathing complex kept the temperature above the outside. Reading was a warm weather of the mind activity conducted in warm weather of the body spaces. You are not in a library tonight. You are in your room. But if you could afford it, the library and the baths would have been open this afternoon, and the warmth of it, the scrolls, the silence, the heated floor, was available to anyone who presented themselves. Rome offered this. The cold outside the door was real. So was the library. The night in Rome is not safe. The vigils, the fire-watching police force established by Augustus, patrolled the streets. 7 cohorts, each responsible for 2 of the city's 14 regions, walking their circuits through the night. Their primary mandate was fire detection. Their secondary mandate was general security. The dark streets of a city of 1 million people. The delivery wagons creating noise and opportunity. The taverns that stayed open late, generating the specific kind of trouble that taverns generate. The Roman street at night was in theory off-limits to wheeled vehicles during the day, creating the paradox that all the deliveries the city required happened in the hours of darkness, filling the night streets with wagon traffic that made them simultaneously more active and more dangerous. The carter who drove his wagon through the night streets was not committing a crime. The pedestrian he ran over was not technically his problem in the strict sense that Roman law applied to such collisions. Walking in Rome at night was not recommended for those who had alternatives. The alternatives were to stay where you were, which in winter meant staying where the warmth was. The late tavern, the friend's house, the patron's dinner extended into the evening, or to travel in company, which distributed both the risk and the warmth. The wealthy were carried in litters and attended by torch-bearing slaves, which solved both the darkness and the cold simultaneously. The ordinary Roman who had to navigate the night streets of Rome in January did so with the specific alertness of the vulnerable in a dangerous environment, aware of what was behind them, attentive to the sounds of the street, moving with purpose toward the destination, and not lingering. The vigiles passed with their lanterns. The delivery wagons rumbled on their rounds. The city that never fully slept continued its night business. You made it to your door. You made it inside. You climbed the stairs. Your room was cold and your brazier needed lighting, and the street noise came through the shutter and the night was long. But you were inside. The door was shut. The key was in the lock. This was the Roman safety of a January night. Not warmth, not silence, not security in any absolute sense. Inside, with the door shut. Good enough. Rome was not the whole empire, and the winter that Rome experienced, cold, wet, managed by baths and braziers and wine and wool, was only one version of the Roman winter. Across the empire's enormous territory, Roman people and Roman-administered peoples experienced winter in conditions ranging from the genuinely mild to the genuinely lethal. In Britain, the Roman soldiers of Hadrian's Wall experienced a winter that was not the gentle wet cold of Italy, but the raw, wind-driven cold of the northern English moorland, where the wind came from the north without obstruction and the temperature dropped reliably below freezing for weeks at a time. The thermae in the frontier forts were not a luxury there. They were a medical necessity. In Egypt, Rome's most important grain province, the source of the grain that fed the capital, winter barely existed. The Nile Valley in December was warm and dry, and the inhabitants who received Roman administration experienced winter as a phenomenon of the northern provinces that had nothing to do with their reality. In Syria and the eastern provinces, winter was real but Mediterranean, cold nights, mild days, rain rather than snow in the lowlands. In Germany and the Danube region, winter was serious. The accounts of the German campaigns describe conditions that the legions from the Mediterranean provinces found genuinely shocking. Temperatures well below freezing, deep snow, the frozen Rhine providing crossings for the Germanic peoples who were supposed to be on the other side of it. The Roman army adapted to this with the pragmatism that it applied to every operational challenge, but it never fully made peace with the German winter. The empire that appears uniform on the map was experienced differently in every province, and nowhere more differently than in winter. The Rome you are surviving tonight is the warm end of the spectrum. Be glad you are not on the Rhine. The 1st of March. In the old Roman calendar, the calendar before Julius Caesar's Reformation, before the addition of the months named for him and for Augustus, March was the first month, the beginning of the year, the month when the military campaign season reopened, when the farming year began its serious work, when the cold released its grip on the Italian peninsula and the world began again. March still carried that significance even after it moved to the 3rd position in the reformed calendar. The Ides of March was the festival of Mars, the god of war and agriculture, simultaneously, the god who presided over both of the activities that March reopened. The trumpets that the Salii priests carried through the city on the Ides were sacred instruments dedicated to Mars, their ritual procession marking the year's most important transition. The cold was not gone in March. A Roman March could be cold and wet and miserable, but it was cold with the quality of ending. The cold of something in retreat rather than something establishing itself. The flowers were starting. The markets were beginning to see the first spring produce. The roads that weather had made difficult were improving, and the days in March are longer than the days in January by approximately an hour and a half. That hour and a half is not abstract. It is light in the morning when you wake. It is light in the evening when you return from the bath. It is the difference between a day that felt like survival and a day that felt like living. You have survived the Roman winter, not by any single strategy, not by the baths alone, not by the wine alone, not by the layering, or the brazier, or the patron's dinner, or the Saturnalia candle, by all of them together. The Roman winter was survived the way all winters are survived. Collectively, incrementally, through the accumulated small strategies of people who had been doing this every year of their lives and whose culture had refined those strategies over centuries. The sun is stronger today. You can feel it. Step back now, before we end, and see it whole. The Roman winter survival system was not a collection of individual strategies. It was a system, an integrated, city-wide, empire-wide response to the seasonal challenge of cold that worked at multiple scales simultaneously. At the infrastructure scale, the aqueducts that kept water flowing through winter, the road network that kept supply chains open, the grain supply from Egypt that kept the population fed, the vigils that reduced the fire risk, the thermae that provided heat to everyone. At the technological scale, the hypocaust that provided the most efficient room heating available in the ancient world, the wool industry that produced the clothing that layered against the cold, the wine production and spice trade that provided the warming drinks that the culture had built into its winter practice. At the social scale, the patronage system that distributed resources through networks of mutual obligation, the Saturnalia that provided annual communal warmth, the baths that provided daily social warmth, the thermopolium where a hot meal could be obtained by anyone with a coin. At the cultural scale, the calendar that gave the winter its structure, the festivals that gave it its meaning, the literature and philosophy that processed it into something more than mere endurance. None of this worked perfectly. The poor were cold in ways the infrastructure did not address. The enslaved were cold in ways the social system explicitly required. The old and the infant died at rates that the medical system accepted as seasonal reality. But the system worked well enough that 1 million people survived every Roman winter, year after year, century after century, in a city that should have been too large, too dense, too vulnerable to the forces that cold exerts on human populations. They survived it, and in surviving it, they built something that the cold could not finally reach: the accumulated knowledge, the engineering achievement, the social practice, the cultural identity that was Rome. The marble that we photograph in summer was built by people who were cold in January. The aqueducts that are still standing were engineered by people who needed water in winter. The roads that connected the empire were built by soldiers who slept in cold tents on the German frontier. The Rome we remember was also this Rome, the cold Rome, the January, the Rome of braziers and wool and hot wine, and the baths, and the long night, and the first warmth of the March sun. This was Rome too. You are back in your modern bed. The Roman winter is over. For you, in the way that this video's immersion is over, the return from the ancient world to the present one that always happens at the end of these journeys. Take a moment to notice what you are returning to. Your room is heated, not by a brazier you need to tend, and that could kill you if you fell asleep next to it with the window shut. Not by a hypocaust that requires a person continuously at the furnace below. By a system so reliable that you have not thought about it once today, that operates without your attention, that will be running when you wake in the morning just as it was running when you went to sleep. Your water is clean, not merely aqueduct clean, a considerable achievement in the ancient world, but treated and tested and delivered under pressure to the tap above your sink, available in any quantity at any hour, and it will not make you sick. This is a thing that was not available to the Romans or to anyone until the 20th century. Your bed is warm. The wool of ancient Rome was the best the world had until the development of synthetic insulating materials, but it was damp from the winter humidity and stiff from weeks of use, and your mattress was rope and straw, and what is under you tonight is none of those things. The Roman who survived winter, who made it from October to March with the brazier and the baths and the wool and the wine and the community of the city was not less capable, or less intelligent, or less human than you. They were navigating a genuine challenge with the tools their world provided, and those tools were considerable. But you were warm in ways they were not, and knowing that, understanding the specific, detailed reality of what they managed and how, makes the warmth you have tonight something more than ambient. It is earned, not by you, but for you, by the accumulated technological and social progress of the 2,000 years between their January and yours. You are warm. The Roman winter is over. You survived it. Now rest. The fire is low. The brazier's glow in your mind's eye fades to embers. The baths close. The Saturnalia candle burns to its end. Sleep.